"So this is Daniel's mother?" someone asked, glancing at my shoes before they even looked at my face. I smiled and nodded, as if I hadn't noticed the pause, the subtle shift in the room when I stepped inside. I had chosen that outfit carefully. A simple beige cardigan, a pair of worn leather flats, and a handbag I'd owned for over a decade. Nothing about me said wealth. Nothing about me demanded respect. That was the point. I wanted to see who they really were when they thought I had nothing to offer. The house itself was impressive in a loud, deliberate way. High ceilings, marble floors that echoed under every step, and walls covered in oversized artwork that felt more expensive than meaningful. Chloe greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Collins," she said, her tone warm but measured, as though she were greeting a distant acquaintance rather than her future mother-in-law. Behind her stood her parents, Richard and Elaine Bennett, both dressed in tailored clothes that fit just a little too perfectly, like they had something to prove. Richard extended his hand, but his grip was brief, almost dismissive. Elaine's smile lingered a second too long, her eyes scanning me in a way that felt more like an evaluation than a welcome. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said, though her voice carried a hint of curiosity that bordered on skepticism. I stepped inside, taking in the room without letting my gaze linger on anything too expensive. I knew this type of setting. I had lived in it once, long before I learned the value of being underestimated. Daniel appeared moments later, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a quick hug, the only genuine gesture in the room. For a moment I allowed myself to feel it, the warmth, the familiarity. But it faded quickly as I noticed the way Chloe's eyes followed the interaction, calculating, observant. We moved into the sitting area, where a low glass table was already set with coffee and neatly arranged pastries. Elaine gestured for me to sit, choosing a seat across from me that gave her a clear view of everything. My posture, my clothes, even the way I held my cup. "Daniel tells us you live out in the suburbs," she began, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. I nodded. "A small place," I said simply. That was all she needed. I saw it then, the subtle exchange between her and Richard, the almost imperceptible nod, as if they had just confirmed something important. "That must be peaceful," Richard added, though the slight pause before the word made it sound like a polite substitute for something else. I smiled again, keeping my voice soft. "It is." Chloe leaned forward slightly, resting her hand on Daniel's arm. "We've been talking about the future," she said, her voice light but deliberate. "About what kind of life we want to build." I met her gaze, calm and steady. "That's important," I said. She held my eyes for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. But I gave her nothing. That was part of the game too. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them decide. The conversation drifted into safer territory, work, travel, plans, but underneath it all I could feel the current pulling in one direction. Every question had a purpose. Every smile carried weight. And with each passing minute, they were building a version of me in their minds. A smaller version. A simpler one. Someone easy to overlook. I took a slow sip of my coffee and set the cup down carefully, my hands steady, my expression unchanged. I had seen this before, the quiet judgment, the polite dismissal, the assumption that worth could be measured in appearances. They thought they understood me. They thought they had already decided who I was. And I let them believe it. Because the truth is, people reveal far more about themselves when they think no one is watching. And tonight I wasn't here to be accepted. I was here to observe. I was here to measure. And so far they were telling me everything I needed to know. I did not choose that cardigan by accident, and I did not forget to polish my shoes. Every detail they saw was a decision, every imperfection carefully placed, every silence measured. I had learned a long time ago that people do not reveal themselves when you stand tall in front of them. They reveal themselves when they believe you are beneath them. And tonight I gave them exactly that illusion. Elaine poured more coffee into my cup without asking, her smile still fixed. But there was a subtle shift now. A confidence settling into her posture, as if she had already categorized me. "Daniel mentioned you used to work," she said, the word used carrying just enough weight to make it clear she was not asking out of curiosity. I nodded slowly. "I did," I said. "For many years." I did not elaborate. I did not offer titles or accomplishments. I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to fill it with her own assumptions. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, his gaze drifting briefly toward the large windows before returning to me. Retirement must be an adjustment, he added, his tone polite but distant. I could hear what he was not saying. I have seen it before, in boardrooms and charity galas, in places where value is assigned before a person even speaks. I smiled gently. You get used to it, I replied. Chloe watched me closely, her fingers lightly resting on Daniel's sleeve, her expression composed but alert. She was not as careless as her parents. She was listening between the lines, searching for something that did not quite fit. That made her more dangerous. We have always believed in planning ahead, Elaine continued, her voice taking on a tone that sounded almost instructional. Especially when it comes to family stability. Financial security is very important. I nodded again slowly, as if agreeing without fully understanding. Of course, I said. That seemed to encourage her. Daniel has done very well for himself, she added, glancing at her daughter with a small, satisfied smile. And Chloe has always been very particular about the kind of life she wants. The message was clear now. They were not asking questions anymore. They were setting expectations. And in their minds I did not quite belong in that picture. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his jaw tightening for just a moment before he forced a small smile. Mom has always been independent, he said, his voice steady but careful. She does not need much. I turned to him, meeting his eyes with a calm expression, giving him a slight nod as if to reassure him. He did not know what I was doing. He thought he was protecting me. That almost made me smile. Elaine's lips curved again, but this time it felt different, softer, more certain. That is admirable, she said, though her tone suggested something closer to relief than admiration. I could see it now. The tension had eased. The questions had slowed. They had reached their conclusion. In their minds I was simple, harmless, uncomplicated. And most importantly, I was not a factor they needed to worry about. I lifted my cup and took another sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest as I observed the room once more. The polished surfaces, the carefully chosen decor, the quiet confidence of people who believed they understood the world because it had always reflected their expectations back at them. I had once lived in a world like this. I had once been surrounded by people who measured worth in the same quiet, invisible ways. And I had learned exactly how dangerous those assumptions could be. Chloe leaned in again, her voice softer now, almost conversational. We are having dinner later, she said. A small place downtown. You should come. I looked at her for a moment, then smiled, the same calm, unassuming smile I had worn since the moment I arrived. I would love to, I said. And as I set my cup down, I realized something had already been decided. Not by them but by me. Because this was not just a meeting anymore. This was a test. And they had no idea they had already started to fail. The drive downtown was quiet, but not uncomfortable, just filled with the kind of silence that reveals more than conversation ever could. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the wheel, while Chloe scrolled through her phone beside him, her expression calm, almost detached. I sat in the back seat, watching the city lights stretch across the windows, reflecting in soft streaks that blurred together the longer I looked. I had always liked this part of the evening, the moment before everything unfolds, when people still believe they are in control of how they will be seen. The restaurant they chose was exactly what I expected. Valet parking, glass doors that open before you touch them, soft lighting designed to flatter everyone in the room. The kind of place where conversations are quiet but judgments are loud. A young man in a pressed uniform approached the car as soon as we stopped. Good evening, he said, opening the door for Chloe first. She stepped out with practiced ease, handing over the keys without hesitation. Daniel followed, then turned to offer me his hand. I took it with a small smile, stepping out carefully, my worn shoes touching the polished pavement like they did not quite belong there. I noticed it immediately, the brief glance from the valet, the quick shift in his expression before he masked it again. It was subtle, but I had spent enough years reading rooms to recognize it. We walked inside together, Chloe leading slightly ahead, her posture confident, her steps measured. The host greeted her by name. Of course he did. Your table is ready, he said, his tone warm, attentive. He barely glanced at me. That was fine. I preferred it that way. Our table was near the center of the room, visible enough to be noticed, private enough to feel exclusive. Elaine and Richard were already seated, their posture relaxed, as if they had been here many times before. Elaine stood when we approached, her smile returning to that same polished version from earlier. Perfect timing, she said. I took my seat quietly, placing my handbag beside me, my movements unhurried, controlled. The menus were handed out, thick and heavy, filled with items that were described more than they were named. I opened mine slowly, scanning it without reacting, though I could feel their attention shifting toward me again. They have an excellent wine list here, Richard said, glancing in my direction as if testing something. Chloe smiled. We usually let my dad choose, she added, her tone light but deliberate. I looked up briefly. I trust your judgment, I said softly. That was all it took. The waiter arrived and Richard began ordering with confidence, selecting dishes without consulting anyone, his voice steady, assured. When the waiter turned to me there was a pause. Just a moment. And for you, ma'am? He asked. I glanced back at the menu, then chose the simplest option I could find. I will have the roasted chicken, I said. It was not the cheapest item but it was close enough. I saw it then. Elaine's eyes flickered. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. Richard gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, as if another piece had just fallen into place. The conversation flowed easily after that, but not naturally. Every topic circled back to the same place. Travel, investments, properties, subtle mentions of vacation, homes and future plans. And each time there was a pause just long enough for me to contribute, to reveal something about myself. I did not. I listened. I smiled. I asked simple questions that made them speak more. Because the more they spoke, the clearer everything became. At one point, Elaine leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to feel personal. It is important for families to be aligned, she said, especially when it comes to expectations. I met her gaze, calm and steady. I agree, I replied. And I did. Just not in the way she thought. The plates arrived, the conversation continued, and the evening moved forward exactly as I had expected. They were comfortable now. Certain. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they had already measured my place in it. I picked up my fork, taking a small, careful bite, and let the silence settle for a moment longer than necessary. Because the truth was, this dinner was never about the food. It was about what people reveal when they think the outcome has already been decided. And tonight they were revealing everything. Halfway through the meal, I stopped tasting the food entirely. Not because it was bad, but because I had shifted my attention somewhere else, somewhere more important. Patterns. That is what I was watching now. The rhythm of their words, the way they took turns steering the conversation, the subtle glances exchanged when they thought no one noticed. It was coordinated. Not rehearsed, but familiar. This was not the first time they had assessed someone like this. Elaine set her fork down gently, dabbing the corner of her lips with a napkin before turning her attention back to me. Margaret, she said, using my name for the first time that evening, as if it marked a transition into something more direct. Have you ever considered downsizing? The question was soft, almost thoughtful, but it landed exactly where it was meant to. I looked at her, tilting my head slightly as if considering it for the first time. I suppose I have, I said. That was enough. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, his tone measured. It can be a very practical decision, he added. Less maintenance. More flexibility. Chloe nodded, her expression thoughtful, but there was something else beneath it now. A quiet calculation that had begun to surface more clearly. Especially at this stage, she said, her voice gentle but precise. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably. Mom is doing just fine, he said, his voice firm but controlled. I glanced at him briefly, offering a small, reassuring smile before turning back to the others. I appreciate the concern, I said calmly. And I did. Just not in the way they intended. Because this was not concern. This was positioning. They were mapping out a future, one where I existed in a smaller space, one that required less from them. one that made everything simpler. I had seen this before. Years ago, in rooms much larger than this one, with people who wore their confidence like armor. Back when my husband was still alive, when we built something from nothing and watched it grow into something people respected, even envied. I remembered the long nights, the quiet sacrifices, the decisions that no one else ever saw. I remembered the day we signed the papers that changed everything, the way he had looked at me across that table, his hand steady, his voice certain. "We did this together," he had said. And we had. Every step, every risk, every success. After he passed, I made a choice. Not to disappear but to step back. To let the noise settle. To see who remained when the spotlight was gone. And over the years, I learned something far more valuable than recognition. I learned how people behave when they think you no longer matter. The conversation at the table continued, but I was no longer following every word. I did not need to. I already understood the direction it was heading. Elaine spoke about long-term planning. Richard mentioned investment strategies. Chloe brought up lifestyle expectations. And through it all, there was a quiet thread connecting everything. Control. Not overt, not aggressive, but steady and deliberate. I picked up my glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the coolness ground me in the present. Then I set it down with care, my movements unhurried, my expression unchanged. Because this was the moment where everything became clear. Not for them but for me. They were not just measuring me. They were deciding what role I would play in their version of the future. A smaller role. A quieter one. Something manageable. I folded my hands lightly in my lap, listening as Elaine continued speaking, her voice smooth, confident, certain of the path she was describing. And I realized something then, something simple but important. They believed this conversation was about guidance, about helping me, about shaping a future that made sense. But it was not. It was a test. And they still did not understand who was really asking the questions. The plates had been cleared, but no one seemed ready to leave. That was when I knew the evening was not over. Not for them. Not yet. The waiter returned with a polished leather folder and placed it gently at the edge of the table, closer to Richard than anyone else. He did not open it right away. Instead, he let it sit there like a quiet invitation. A moment to observe. A moment to decide. Chloe glanced at her father, then at Daniel, her expression calm but expectant. Elaine adjusted her posture slightly, folding her hands in front of her, her eyes drifting toward me for just a second before returning to the center of the table. It was subtle, almost polite, but I recognized it immediately. This was not about payment. This was about positioning. Richard finally reached for the folder, opening it slowly, scanning the total with a brief nod. No surprise. No hesitation. Just confirmation. He closed it again but did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward Daniel. "It is a lovely place," he said casually. Daniel gave a small nod. "It is," he replied. His voice was steady, but I could hear the hesitation underneath. Chloe placed her hand lightly on his arm again, her touch gentle but guiding. "We like to come here for special occasions," she added, her tone soft but deliberate. There it was. The invitation without asking. The expectation without stating it. I sat quietly, my hands resting in my lap, my expression unchanged. I did not move. I did not reach for anything. I simply watched. Daniel cleared his throat softly, glancing between his father-in-law and the folder on the table. "I can take care of it," he said, his voice polite, almost automatic. Richard smiled faintly, a gesture that looked generous on the surface. "That is not necessary," he replied. But he did not move either. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around Daniel's sleeve, just enough to be felt, not enough to be seen by anyone who was not looking for it. Elaine's eyes flickered toward me again, this time lingering just a fraction longer. Waiting. Measuring. I understood then. This was not about who could pay. It was about who would. And more importantly, who should. I let the silence stretch, just long enough for the weight of it to settle over the table. Then I reached for my handbag slowly, deliberately, as if I had only just realized the bill was there. I opened it, taking my time, my movements calm, unhurried. I could feel their attention sharpen, their expectations shifting into place. This was the moment they had been building toward. The quiet confirmation of everything they believed about me. I looked inside my bag, then paused, my expression softening just slightly. "Oh," I said gently, almost to myself. "I am afraid I did not bring enough for something like this." I closed the bag again, placing it back beside me with care. There it was. The final piece. The confirmation they had been waiting for. Richard gave a small, understanding nod. Elaine's lips curved into a polite, sympathetic smile. Chloe exhaled softly, her posture relaxing just enough to reveal relief. Daniel looked down at the table, his jaw tightening, his hand already reaching toward the folder. I did not stop him. I did not say anything else. I simply sat there, composed, quiet, letting the moment settle exactly where they expected it to. Because sometimes the most important truths are not revealed by what people say. They are revealed by what people assume when you give them the chance. And tonight they had just told me everything. Daniel reached for the folder, but before his fingers could touch it, the waiter returned. His steps slowed as he approached the table, his expression shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who was not paying close attention. He looked at me, not briefly, not casually, but with recognition. It was the kind of look that does not belong in a place like this unless something does not match the surface. "Excuse me," he said softly, addressing the table, but his eyes remained on me for a fraction longer than necessary. "Ma'am," he added, turning slightly toward me. "I apologize, but may I confirm your name?" The question landed quietly, but it changed the air in an instant. Elaine straightened slightly. Richard's hand paused mid-motion. Chloe's eyes flickered toward me, sharp, searching. Daniel looked confused, his hand hovering over the folder. I met the waiter's gaze calmly, my expression unchanged. "Margaret Collins," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize anything. I simply said it the way I always had. The waiter nodded once, his posture shifting almost immediately, his tone becoming more formal, more precise. "Thank you, Miss Collins," he said. "There has been a note placed on your reservation." He reached forward and gently took the leather folder from the table before Daniel could pick it up. Richard frowned slightly, his brows tightening. "I believe we were about to settle that," he said, his voice polite but edged with mild irritation. The waiter offered a professional smile. "Of course, sir," he replied. "But this particular reservation has already been handled." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. Not the polite kind. The kind that stretches just long enough for uncertainty to settle in. Chloe's hand slipped from Daniel's arm. Elaine's expression froze, her smile no longer quite reaching her eyes. Richard leaned back slightly, studying the waiter now with a different kind of attention. "Handled," he repeated. The waiter inclined his head slightly. "Yes, sir. The account on file has taken care of the evening in full." Daniel looked at me then, confusion clear in his eyes. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned to him, offering the same gentle smile I had worn all evening. "It is all right," I said softly. That was all. No explanation. No elaboration. Just enough to settle him, but not enough to answer the question forming in his mind. The waiter stepped back, but not before addressing me one more time. "If there is anything else you require this evening, please let us know," he said. The tone was different now. Respectful. Attentive. Certain. He left the table without another word, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before it. Elaine was the first to move, her fingers adjusting the edge of her napkin with a precision that suggested control, but her eyes betrayed something else. Uncertainty. "That was unexpected," she said carefully. Richard's gaze shifted between me and the space where the folder had been, his expression no longer confident, but calculating in a different way now. Chloe did not speak. She was watching me, really watching me this time, as if trying to piece together something that no longer fit the version she had created earlier. Daniel leaned slightly closer. "What was that about?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes again, calm, steady. "Just an arrangement," I said, and I left it there. Because the truth does not always need to be explained. Sometimes it only needs to be revealed at the right moment. I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip, my movements as composed as they had been all evening. But the room had changed. The balance had shifted. The assumptions that had once filled the space were no longer holding their shape. And for the first time that night, they were no longer certain of who I was. And that was exactly where I wanted them. No one spoke for a few seconds after that. It was not the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind that forced people to think, to recalculate, to quietly question everything they had already decided. I set my glass down with the same steady motion, my eyes drifting briefly across the table, not searching, not avoiding, simply observing. Elaine was the first to recover, though not completely. Her posture remained upright, her expression composed, but there was a slight hesitation now in the way she moved, as if she were choosing each gesture more carefully than before. "That was very generous," she said, her tone measured, almost cautious. I turned to her with a small, polite smile. "It was already arranged," I replied. Richard leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced on the table, his gaze fixed on me in a way that was no longer dismissive. It was sharper now, focused. "Arranged by whom?" he asked. The question was direct, but his voice carried something new. Not authority, not assumption. Curiosity. I held his gaze for a moment, letting the question sit between us before answering. "By me," I said simply. That was all it took. Chloe's breath caught just slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied me, not with judgment this time, but with calculation. Daniel shifted in his seat, looking from me to the others, trying to understand the shift he could clearly feel but not yet explain. "Mom," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I looked at him, my expression softening just a little. "I mean that I knew we would be here tonight," I said. "And I prefer not to leave things to chance." It was the truth. Just not all of it. Elaine's fingers tightened around her napkin, though her smile returned, more controlled now, less certain. "You must come here often then," she said, her voice light but probing. I shook my head gently. "Not often," I replied. "But enough." Richard's eyes flickered, the pieces beginning to shift in his mind, though they had not yet settled into place. "Enough for them to recognize you," he said. It was not a question. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for my handbag, adjusting its position slightly on the chair beside me, a small, ordinary movement that gave me just enough time to let the moment stretch. Then I looked back at him. "Recognition is not always about frequency," I said calmly. "Sometimes it is about history." That word lingered in the air longer than the others. History. It was not something they could measure with a glance or define with a quick assumption. Chloe leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. The confidence she had carried earlier was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer rooted in certainty. It was searching now. Testing. "What kind of history?" she asked. Her voice was steady but quieter than before. I met her gaze without hesitation. "The kind you do not see at first," I said. And I let the silence follow, because this was where everything began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the space between what they thought they knew and what they were just beginning to realize. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the confusion on his face deepening. "You never mentioned any of this," he said. I smiled at him gently. "There are many things we do not mention," I said, "until they matter." And now, for the first time that evening, I could see it clearly. The balance had moved. The assumptions that once gave them confidence were no longer enough. And in their place, something else had begun to form. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, I had learned, is where the truth begins to surface. The table did not return to what it had been before. Conversations resumed, but they moved differently. Now slower, more deliberate, as if every word had to be weighed before it was spoken. I did not rush to fill the silence. I had learned that silence, when used correctly, reveals far more than conversation ever could. Elaine adjusted her posture again, her voice softer now, almost careful. "You mentioned history," she said. "That sounds significant." I looked at her, letting a small pause settle before I responded. "It is," I said simply. Richard leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that was no longer dismissive, no longer casual. He was searching now, trying to reconstruct something that no longer aligned with his earlier assumptions. "You speak as if you have been part of this world for a long time," he said. I met his gaze calmly. "Long enough," I replied. That was all. But it was enough. Chloe shifted in her seat, her confidence no longer rooted in certainty, but in curiosity that bordered on unease. Daniel never mentioned anything like this, she said. Her tone was controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Something unsettled. I turned to Daniel briefly, offering him a gentle smile. There are parts of our lives that do not always come up in conversation, I said. Especially when they no longer define how we choose to live. That word again. Choose. It lingered in the air, subtle but intentional. Elaine's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. You chose to step away, she asked. I nodded once. Yes. I did not elaborate. I did not explain the scale of what I had stepped away from or why. I simply let them sit with the idea that there had been something to leave behind. Richard's expression shifted again, the pieces continuing to rearrange in his mind. That would suggest, he said slowly, that you had something substantial to begin with. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for my handbag once more, opening it this time not as a gesture, but with purpose. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it. Order has always mattered to me. Not because of appearance but because of clarity. I removed a small, simple card holder and placed it gently on the table in front of me. No ruse. No emphasis. Just a quiet action. Chloe's eyes followed the movement instantly. Elaine leaned forward just slightly. Richard's gaze sharpened. Daniel looked between me and the card holder, confusion still written across his face. I slid one card out and placed it on the table, turning it so it faced them. I did not push it forward. I did not explain it. I simply let it rest there. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Elaine was the first to glance down. Her eyes moved across the card, then stopped. Completely. The change in her expression was immediate, though she tried to contain it. Richard leaned in next, his brows tightening as he read, then lifting slightly in a way that suggested recognition, or at least realization. Chloe did not move right away. She watched their reactions first, her instincts guiding her, before finally lowering her gaze to the card. The moment she read it, something shifted in her face that she could not hide. Not fully. Daniel reached for the card last, picking it up slowly, as if he was not entirely sure what he was about to see. His eyes scanned it once, then again, slower this time. Mom, he said quietly. I did not interrupt him. I did not explain. Because the card said enough. It always had. I folded my hands gently in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. The room had not grown louder, but it felt different now. Heavier. Clearer. Because there are moments when the truth does not need to be spoken. It only needs to be placed in front of the right people at the right time. And tonight that moment had finally arrived. No one reached for their glass after that. No one adjusted their posture. Even the quiet hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, as if the moment at our table had separated itself from everything else around us. Daniel was still holding the card, his fingers tighter now, his eyes moving across it one more time as if he needed to be certain he had read it correctly. You own this group? He asked, his voice lower than before, stripped of the ease he had carried earlier. I looked at him, not with pride, not with emphasis, just with the same calm I had maintained all evening. Part of it, I said. That was enough. Elaine's composure, so carefully maintained until now, shifted in a way she could not fully conceal. Her smile returned, but it was different, stretched thinner, more deliberate. Margaret, I had no idea, she said quickly. You never mentioned. I held her gaze gently. You never asked, I replied. The words were not sharp, but they settled with weight. Richard cleared his throat, his posture adjusting, his tone recalibrating. Well, that certainly changes things, he said, though he did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Chloe remained quiet the longest. Her eyes stayed on me, but they were no longer searching for weakness. They were measuring something else now, something she had not accounted for. Why would you present yourself differently? She finally asked, her voice steady but careful. I let a small pause settle before answering. Because how people treat you when they believe you have nothing tells you everything about who they are, I said. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because there was nothing to argue with. Daniel leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair, the realization settling across his face. You were testing us, he said. I did not correct him. I did not confirm it outright either. I simply looked at him and said, I was paying attention. That was the truth. Elaine's hands folded together tightly on the table, her voice softer now, almost conciliatory. If anything we said earlier came across the wrong way, she began. I shook my head gently, stopping her before she could finish. It came across exactly the way it was intended, I said. My tone remained calm, but there was no space left for misunderstanding. Richard exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if accepting something he could no longer reshape. Chloe's posture straightened, her expression settling into something more controlled, but not as certain as before. She understood now. Not everything, but enough. I reached forward, taking the card back from Daniel's hand, placing it carefully into my holder before returning it to my bag. The motion was small but final. Then I looked at each of them one by one, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity. Respect is not something you adjust once you learn someone's value, I said quietly. It is something you either offer from the beginning, or you do not offer at all. The words settled between us, not raised, not forced, but undeniable. No one responded. There was nothing left to say. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my cardigan, the same simple piece they had dismissed when I first walked in. Daniel stood with me, his expression still uncertain but softer now. Chloe remained seated for a moment longer before rising as well, her movements measured, her thoughts clearly still shifting. Elaine and Richard followed, their earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something more careful. I offered a polite smile, the same one I had worn from the beginning, but it carried a different meaning now. Not submission. Not politeness. Closure. It was a lovely evening, I said. And then I turned, walking toward the exit with steady steps, leaving behind the version of me they had created, and the truth they had only just begun to understand.